We're ready to go live now, Natalie. You can unshare your screen.
You can unshare it, Gary?
Yes, please. Yeah, can you unshare, Natalie?
Oh, sorry, Gary, I'm having trouble.
All right. Okay, no problem.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I can't unshare my screen. I'm really sorry. Gary, can you unshare my screen for me?
Yeah, I'm just trying. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. And hopefully you can hear me if you might not be able to see me now, but hopefully you can see me. Oh, great. Right, we've turned off and we've got through the inevitable Zoom chaos at the beginning. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone. We're just going to give this a few more minutes for people to sign in. But it just behoves me to introduce myself as Natalie Orringe. I'm Head of Communications at the Institute of Development Studies. And it is with great pleasure that I'm here to open a session today to talk about a very pertinent topic for so many of us in research communications, the role of the media in reporting on science in uncertainty. And in terms of the format for today, we have a brilliant panel of speakers who I'm going to invite in the next few minutes to introduce themselves and then also give their perspective to that central question of what role should the media take in reporting on science. After their brief presentations, we're then going to move into a Q&A session, and we've got a few questions to kick that discussion off, but we'd really welcome you to submit your questions into the Zoom chat, which is just within Zoom, or to submit your questions to the YouTube channel, because I know that we're also live streaming this, and again, we'll be sharing those questions with the panelists. I guess before I hand over to those panelists, I wanted to just almost set the scene really as to why we thought this question was so pertinent for all of us working in research and the development sector. And really was to contextualise it by thinking about what's passed before us in the last 18 months. We've gone through huge uncertainty, huge change and volatility in almost every aspect of how we live. And actually, almost what's happened is that we've seen a resurgence in the strength of editorial media in news publishers who almost a few years back, we might have been sort of calling their demise when we thought about the impact of social media and the rise of citizen journalism. So in the context of contested evidence, when policy debates are becoming ever more complex, what role do journalists play? And actually, has COVID really changed fundamentally the role of media in terms of mediating policymakers and public discourse? And I think, you know, it's just, again, really interesting when we think about the fact that so many organisations and scientists who we may never have been aware of before are now suddenly household names. Again, it just raises some really important questions about research communications and engagement with the media going forward. So if that's by way of introduction, then I'd really like to hand over to our first panelist, Vanessa Offiong, to introduce herself and answer the thorny question of what role the media should take in reporting on science. Vanessa.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon from Nigeria. I am Vanessa Offiong, as she said. I'm a journalist. I started off at Daily Trust, then went to corporate accountability for public participation Africa as program manager. And now I am a reporter with CNN on the As Equals project. It's nice to be here and to be a part of this conversation. So I'll go right to answer the question, Natalie. I would say, speaking from my experience being in the Global South, where I have done most of my journalism practice, it is important for us as journalists to open our networks wider beyond our journalism networks, to go on to research, to collaborate with researchers, with organizations like the church, and non-governmental organizations who are on ground doing work and gathering evidence and data that are verifiable and useful for our work as journalists as well, to communicate this information to the public. It's important that we're also using these other networks to call, to to call to account policymakers and leaders and also the general public where need be, as there will be benefits, in sharing the results and the findings of this work carried out by these organizations beyond what we as journalists are doing as well. It is an essential role for us as media when we do things like this to engage with research findings and also to be able to communicate these to the public from an informed perspective, acting as middlemen between researchers and the public, researchers and policymakers and other stakeholders. So I'll stop here for now.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Can I now hand over to Andrew Jack to introduce himself and also answer that question for us?
Thanks very much, Natalie, and great to be here. So I've been for many years at the Financial Times. I've covered different areas, including based in both France and Russia and the US as a foreign correspondent, as well as writing about health over many years, and more recently about education. One thing I'd say is we need to move away from exceptionalism, in this case about science, because the reality is every beat and theme I've covered is surrounded by ambiguity and uncertainty and different interpretations and attempts by people to spin things in different directions. So I think many of the challenges that we faced in an intense way, notably around COVID recently, also apply in many other fields of journalism. And its fundamental role, in my view, is to educate, to popularize, to hold to account, and indeed to channel and disseminate credible insights and promote responsible debate. I think there are some very interesting parallels between what we're seeing around COVID and past and ongoing debates, and I could draw parallels and we can explore these. Climate change is clearly an existential one in many ways. Vaccines and autism, going back a number of years, is a second one. A third one from a very different field where I think there are some striking parallels is Brexit and how that was reported on in different ways. And of course, most recently, COVID. What perhaps has changed in the current context around coronavirus and its reporting and the interrelationship of journalism with science is a couple of things, of course. One is the huge global public interest and focus on it. And that's also meant, of course, a shift from what might have been, let's say, a niche area covered by science and health reporters to one where political journalists, for example, take the lead. And that's come against a background of huge disruptions and changes, of course, the emergence of social media, and very much linked to that, the actual undermining or destabilization of the traditional business model and sources of revenue of mainstream media, if you like. So that's added new external pressures and channels of opinions of variable quality. And it's also weakened perhaps the resourcing and ability of mainstream journalism to respond. And in the same way, the whole move to, if you like, 24-hour journalism also drives a pressure to produce that can be a destabilizing factor. All that said, I think that there's been, and we saw this also incidentally with both Brexit and reporting about Trump at the time of his election. I think there has, and I think we've seen it to some degree in COVID as well, we've seen a surge in readership to our and other core traditional media sites, and indeed even for those like ours which have a paywall, a rise in subscriptions. So that's on the positive side in suggesting perhaps people see the value of searching for quality and recognizing the importance of even paying for high quality news and analysis. The other thing, of course, in the specific context of COVID and science reporting, I think that we've seen in the last few months, compared, for example, with when I was covering H5N1 and previous more modest pandemics in the early 2000s, is the explosion in preprints and what that's done in terms of changing the relationship and the access of nominally peer-reviewed or credible scientific papers, wider access but much earlier, and creating these sort of multiple steps of points at which whether journalists or the public at large have access to early stages of scientific research, and then how far the iterations, as there may be critiques or modifications of those reports before they get to more traditional mainstream academic journals, are circulated. So very, very happy to talk about the wider issues. The only two final points I would make is one, the danger, and we've seen this, of course, in climate change, and we saw this on Brexit, for example, is of false equivalence, as it were. I think it's absolutely necessary to reflect balance and context and different points of views. But I think there's also a responsibility to ensure that those alternative views don't necessarily dominate or lead a story, and there's credibility in the sorts of alternative voices and contextual comments that one puts around any form of scientific reporting. The second thing is, I think, going back to the core question here, the role of the media in reporting on science, I would say the traditional journalistic skills remain as valid and relevant as in any other field of reporting. It's about rigor, about independent voices, about context, and ultimately about judgment. And I think that's the key thing, and that's what really drives, I hope, and continues to drive high quality journalism. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much. Can I now hand over to Mark Galloway?
Thanks, Natalie, and it's great to be here and part of this conversation. I'm currently director of the International Broadcasting Trust, and we look closely at the role of media in engaging audiences with global issues. Before that, I was a TV journalist and commissioning editor at Channel 4. I'm going to talk about specifically climate change. We've had a project at IBT that's tracked media coverage of climate change going back a decade. Some of the things I'll talk about will pick up on what Andrew has just been saying. So when we started 10 years ago, climate change has always been a challenging subject for the media because, as has already been said, it deals in uncertainty and risk rather than certainty. And journalists have struggled to report the issue. They're doing a much better job now, it has to be said. So 10 years ago, we were in a situation where when we looked closely at coverage in the UK, and we actually looked at television news, I think what's interesting is that television news in the UK and in many other countries is the main place that people go to get their news. And we were interested in how this issue was being seen by a mainstream public, so not a public that's already well informed. We found there was very little reporting, there was very little context, and there was this issue of balance, particularly for the BBC, where because the science was uncertain, that news organisations felt that they had to put up a skeptic or a denier in every conversation with a scientist. And the science was constantly questioned, very successfully. So there was a lot of public skepticism, and scientists were reluctant to appear in the media. Now, a lot of that has changed. And I think that media reporting does, to some extent, reflect the current sort of political climate. When we spoke to journalists a decade ago, they didn't want to confront climate change head on. They felt that the audience wasn't interested, and they had to smuggle it into a programme. We have a show in the UK called Grand Designs, which is presented by Kevin MacLeod. Actually, when I was at Channel 4, I commissioned Grand Design, so that's an aside. And he's quoted in one of our reports, and I think this is a reminder of the nervousness that the media had. It's a very revealing quote. He said, "I dread finger wagging at the camera. Television's primary need is to entertain, and only then to educate." So even he, who nowadays has a reputation of talking about these issues, was very nervous then. So if we move forward now, we've got a situation where the science is accepted. We've had organizations like BBC News saying, we're not going to have this notion of false balance. We're not going to challenge the science. We're going to accept it. Scientists are more willing to appear on television. There's a lot more public appetite for data, more public interest, attempts to encourage data numeracy and literacy. The BBC has a very good radio show called More or Less, which has been invaluable during COVID. It chews over the statistics of what's reported in the news and whether it's true or not. I mean, in the current episode, they're talking about the fact that as a result of rising sea levels, large parts of the world will be flooded. More or Less questioned the statistics and found that the headline wasn't accurate. But we do have the deniers or the fossil fuel industry still in the background. We have and they're not questioning the science, but they're questioning the urgency of the action that needs to be taken. So this is a new challenge. Michael Mann, in his recent book, has called it the new climate war. But some broadcasters, interestingly, have now accepted, like the BBC, that this is so important. Some have actually acknowledged there is a climate emergency and have signed up. Sky News, most notably, now has the Daily Climate Show. So we're now seeing climate change talked about in mainstream media. Nevertheless, we have a long way to go to translating this science towards greater public understanding. In the UK, as in many other countries, although perhaps it's worse here than in other places, there's still a lot of reluctance to acknowledge the urgency of the need for action. So really we look to scientists to help us bring that to public attention. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Daniel, can I hand over to you to close this bit of the session?
Thanks very much, Natalie. Thanks for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be on a panel with my colleagues here. So my name is Daniel Cressy. I work at Research Professional News, where I edit content on research policy and funding from teams in the UK and Europe and around the world. Before that, I was a journalist at the journal Nature for 10 years, actually reporting on scientific developments. And before that, I worked for a while as a medical journalist. I think for me, good journalists are at heart professional skeptics. So that makes them ideally placed to be trusted voices in uncertain times and somewhere that the public can go for reliable information during a pandemic, for example. But crucially, I think that trust is nurtured by independence. And we have to be clear that the media is there to contribute to scientific debate, but also to question and to challenge findings, sometimes aggressively if necessary. Science journalism isn't there to promote science per se, or merely to amplify the voices of researchers to a wider audience as some kind of public health message. So we have to provide context, background, and where necessary, platform opposing views and skepticism about particular findings or policies. And doing that regularly and well is why journalists are both necessary and still in a job. And I think that independence and questioning is as important in science journalism as it is for political reporters or sports journalists or anyone else in the media. And there's a reason that people tune into the BBC News in an evening and don't just watch the Prime Minister's COVID press conference. And there's a reason they need to see science reporters talking about what the latest case numbers mean and explaining any uncertainty, and not just hear from one leading epidemiologist every evening. And obviously the reason we're talking about this now is the pandemic, and we have a government that says it's following the science and a whole plethora of different views about what should be done and what has been going on. And there's more uncertainty now, and people are more interested in that uncertainty than they have been in the past. So for me, an independent attitude to that is more necessary. So independence, context, and explaining why different scientists are arguing for different things, explaining why what politicians are doing doesn't match up with what some scientists might be urging. That's fundamentally what reporters and editors do. But I think we also have to acknowledge that this can be messy. I mean, there are perhaps certainties and certain uncertainties and uncertain uncertainties as well. And it can be more art than science constructing stories about those topics, especially when it's not clear which side of an emerging argument is actually right. And we should put right in quote marks there because it's not an unproblematic word. As the people who've gone before me have said, we've seen that maybe most obviously with climate change over the years. And thankfully, most media outlets, as Mark was saying, have shifted away from the kind of false balance debates of the past, where someone who didn't believe this overwhelming evidence of anthropogenic global warming was given time with someone who did. But in other areas, things are less clear-cut about the uncertainties. So if you're looking at the impact of a particular pesticide on particular species, or the risks and benefits of a particular drug in people, or just whether a new signal from a particle accelerator overthrows all of physics or is just noise from the machine. And science questions get even murkier when they lead into policy debates. So it's not uncertain that global warming is happening. But what does that mean should happen? Should we get more nuclear power? Should we ban all cars? Should we bring in population controls? There's a kind of policy magnifier on uncertainty. And that's there with COVID too. So it's a virus, it's spreading, it kills. But does that mean you should lock down? Does that mean you should require vaccination? Some of these questions don't have scientific answers, even though they stem from science. And science journalists have to be clear there too. So the role of the media in reporting on science in uncertainty, for me, it comes in two parts. The first part is to figure out what actually is uncertain and try and figure out how uncertain that is. That's the day-to-day reporting that you expect people like me and my colleagues to be doing. And then conveying that information to the public, writing stories that are balanced and fair and try and sum up what's actually happening in the world. And then we have to do it all over again the next day. And in doing that, we can maintain this kind of vital independent role of journalism as part of the ecosystem of science and research, but also as part of public debate and discourse. And hopefully if we do that well, we can all keep our jobs despite journalism not being what it once was. Thanks.
Daniel, brilliant. Thank you so much. So look, I'm now just going to jump into the Q&A section, and there are some questions coming through already, so thank you very much. So actually, I was going to turn to Vanessa maybe just to kick us off, and it's sort of chime for the question that's come in from one of our attendees listening in, and it's really just to talk about your experience of being a journalist in the global south, and we've touched a bit on this role of journalists being intermediaries between researchers and policymakers. But I wondered if you could talk a bit about how and what you see as some of the challenges around the relationship between researchers, journalists and policymakers, and actually what you would like to see in terms of how those relationships should be structured to address some of the bias that can creep in.
Okay, so something I've always said, and people who are familiar with me with the HSG would say, I'm always saying, we're tired of receiving your press releases. We don't want you thinking about your work, deciding which way you want to go, what the content of that is. And then I'm sitting behind my desk and my email just go pim, pim, pim for urgent, immediate release. We're tired of it. Make us a part of that process from the get-go. Let's see what you're doing as researchers. It's important that you're carrying us along and giving us the opportunity to make our own observations, ask our own questions, because you are the experts. It's our job, it's our obligation to translate what you're doing to the general public. And researchers nowadays do not work in isolation. You know, they're doing research for action. So it's not an era where you're working, it's just your cluster of fellow researchers who are consuming what you're producing. And with the way media is going, with traditional media, social media, and citizen journalists as well, these things are pretty much not as close as they used to be. It's therefore important that researchers have at the back of their mind that what they're doing is supposed to inform action. And a quick way to do that is to have the media be a part of that process, because we need to communicate and communicate accurately, even when it's not just about your research work. We have a science, okay, we're reporting COVID. We have a relationship with you as a virologist or whatever. We have access to you and you're a trusted voice in that field. We can easily reach out to you. If it is that you're doing a research in that regard, or you have a colleague doing a research in that regard, we have access to that information as is permissible to have. And we can share that information with the general public, quell fears, counter fake news and disinformation or under information, and the likes of that. It's for this reason that something like the conversation in South Africa, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with that, was created, where researchers are writing from an expert's perspective, but in a way that is subtle enough for the average person on the streets to be able to consume that information without all the technicalities involved, and they can put to use or apply them where it's necessary for them to do that. It's important that us as journalists also seek out to belong to some of these communities of practices, and that these communities of practice also open their doors to non-experts, so that the conversation and the relationship is a lot more robust. I think this will also quell the suspicion, because sometimes as a journalist, you approach some researchers, and the moment you introduce yourself as a journalist, they lock up. But I think when you have this kind of subtle, friendly entry into those circles, it eases the relationships, which I mean, on the larger picture benefits everybody. Because my view is that researchers, journalists, we're working towards one goal, which is to impact human beings. We're basically using different vehicles, but we need to synergize, we need to harmonize all of those so that there is measurable impact. The work of researchers are not just sitting in libraries and research institutions, but some of it will have trickled down beyond those environments to better the lives of people. I don't know if I've answered this correctly, or you would like me to say something more.
No, that was a very good answer. Thank you. Just kind of picking up on the points you've made there, Vanessa, I wondered, Andrew, if you could almost follow on just to your perspective about how journalists should report on research methodologies when they're shifting and the debate is changing. So almost if, Vanessa's given us an insight into how she'd like to see that relationship change in a much more open discussion, what's your view on how then can a journalist possibly adapt to research that might be changing and shifting, and also then address some of the cynicism that, the public and their audiences may feel in response to some of the findings being presented?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, the starting point, and as we heard from Daniel and others earlier, is that, journalism is not there simply to disseminate, let's say, academic papers. It, by its nature, has to be selective and to try to focus on, the things that are in the zeitgeist, the things that are most important, the things that journalistically we would consider, merit in this huge amount of explosion of information and debate, prioritizing. I totally agree with Vanessa that I think a lot of this is about developing deeper and broader relationships, both with, as it were, mainstream media, but also what you might call sort of intermediary agencies like The Conversation, which I think is a brilliant initiative to try to disseminate scientific insights to a wider audience. I think one thing that I always think is really important is, we need to bring scientists slightly out of their zone of current ultra expertise, should we say, while remaining within their comfort zone. Because the reality is many, scientists are certainly a lot more expert in many more things within and around their field than others are. And so rather than always focusing on the latest, the newest, incremental advance, I think it's the idea of putting new developments into context, and indeed in critiquing other insights and research that are being developed. So in terms of journalistic working with science, that's partly about building the relationships. It's partly about scientists being willing to engage and engage rapidly, because the reality is, you know, the media is very fast moving. And if you won't take that call or reply to that email, the gap will somehow be filled by somebody else who may be actually way less expert or credible. And on the other hand, you've got to be thick-skinned, because your views won't always get in, your papers might not always be cited. But the more you're willing to engage responsibly and build a relationship and a dialogue with credible, trusted journalists over time, I think the healthier that environment. As to this idea of, you know, how you cope with a constantly evolving space, I mean, again, I think, you know, there's a journalistic judgment in trying to understand what's new and what's credible. There's a responsibility to periodically return and to iterate and to interrogate, because as we've said, in science, as in so many other fields, you know, the reality is we're dealing with uncertainty. And so, you know, what seems important at one point and fresh will need to be periodically interrogated and updated, contextualized, indeed contradicted. But we have to do with that within the limits of journalistic resources, of public interest, and of course, this huge explosion of information and debate that's out there today.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, just sort of following on from that response, we've had a few questions in the chat relating to power dynamics, and almost sort of categorising those into the influence of politics on reporting, and particularly some of our commentators are talking about where citizen journalists or journalists themselves may feel unsafe in terms of reporting if they're reporting on a line that's counter to particularly authoritarian states, right through to thinking about the influence of bias in terms of reporting, whether that's bias because of, for example, the academic institution that's publishing, or bias that creeps in between the global north and global south. So I just wondered if I could split those questions out and maybe go to Mark, really, just to give us a perspective on really what role do you think journalism should have in terms of explaining or addressing bias, particularly when it comes to reporting on policy agendas that may be popular to certain governments at certain points in time?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that from my experience, I'd like to agree with the point that that politics does influence the way that journalists report certain issues. I've seen that with the way I've looked at climate change. And politicians are given a very high profile in the media, and we've seen that throughout COVID. And I think there's a responsibility on the media to seek out different players. So researchers and academics and scientists, yes, and I think they need to develop communication skills. So that when someone like Andrew emails them or calls them up, they are used to answering some of those tough questions, or indeed, you know, the way that Daniel has said that scientists will be interrogated. So these relationships, we need to invest more in these relationships so that scientists are more confident in their interactions with the media, and the media are better able to use the science. So there's another set of people whose voices we don't hear much in terms of climate change, the role of business. If you think of all that was happening behind the scenes and still happening in terms of changes in business practice, the media wasn't very good at reflecting that. So there are some gaps in the media. And I think the over-reliance on politics and politicians is counterproductive. It puts certain audiences off. And we're now in this rather surprising situation where, in terms of trust divides along party political lines in the way that responses to climate change do. So, I mean, how is it that whether you believe climate change is real or not has a close relationship in the UK with whether you vote Labour, Lib Dem or Conservative? So we can see that politics is very intertwined, particularly when we look at the issue of climate change.
Well, thank you. Daniel, could I just turn to you on that question? And just, we've talked a bit about the role of the media in terms of bringing in diverse perspectives, particularly on climate change. But do you have a view on whether that ever goes into a potential risk? For example, we've had a question from Sarah IIED around whether it's okay for a researcher to advocate for a particular policy decision based on their findings. Do you think researchers have more sort of responsibility to keep their findings almost separate to policy, or do you think it's okay that there's a kind of greying of some of that decision making?
I think it's almost inevitable that that researchers will be asked policy questions about their work. In the past, it used to be quite common that you'd speak to a researcher about some finding which should have major implications for policy, and they'd say, "Oh no, I just do the science. I won't comment on the policy." And I think we don't see that so much anymore, which is good from my perspective. I think where we have to be clear though is, if researchers are becoming advocates, they need to realize that they are moving into a different arena, and also that we need to be clear where what they're saying is based on their research, and where what they're saying may be completely legitimate views to express but isn't based on their research and goes beyond their research. And that, I think, is quite a difficult line to walk sometimes. So to go back to the example of climate change, there are some really eminent climate change scientists who understand all the modeling work and can tell you exactly how much the Earth is likely to warm in different scenarios. And I want to hear their views, and I want to know their views on policy solutions. But they may be less expert than some social scientists in what we should actually do to mitigate those temperature rises.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely legitimate for researchers to express policy opinions on their research. But sometimes those views aren't necessarily entirely rooted in their research.
It's been very interesting with the recent coverage of changes that the government has announced here in the UK with COVID, that all the scientists who come on, the last question is from the journalist, are you going to carry on wearing a mask or not?
Yeah, this is a great example. So we hear the go-to person for a journalist when we talk about case numbers and restrictions is like, oh, get me an epidemiologist, get me a doctor. If we're actually talking about what's going to make a difference to control of the disease in the UK, we also need to hear from other people, like behavioural science.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Like
So are you going to carry on wearing a mask, Daniel?
I'm just going to move on. Thank you very much for your answer to that, Daniel. We've had a question, and actually, I think interesting in reflecting some of the experience that the community listening in have had in terms of engaging with journalists, and actually a question which is more about some practical advice. So maybe I could direct this one to Vanessa, and the question being, what advice can you give on how to interest a journalist in your research? And often researchers find feedback that their findings are not newsworthy.
Okay, so I think it's important for researchers to be reading media work, so, and then identify journalists who have been persistent with those research topics. Because with the way journalism is going, with data journalism and all of that, and moving away from text, or not so many text heavy, to infographics and all of that, we need those numbers, and we need to humanize those numbers and relate them to actual people. So journalism is doing more, no matter what the topic is. The current trend is that put faces to those numbers and let people be able to connect with the stories that you're writing. So if you identify journalists who have a track record of writing those subjects, it will be easy to get them interested, rather than just do a random search, or just send a press release again to a media house and just expect them to report, he said according to. But if you have a journalist who reports maternal health issues over time, it's not likely that you will have difficulties convincing them to take on a subject. Maybe not as you presented it. They may be able to find a more newsworthy and acceptable approach to tell that story in a way that it's newsworthy, and editors do not have a problem with it. But first, it's important that you identify the right journalist by you yourself as a researcher or a scientist reading and establishing that that journalist is interested in.
think Vanessa may just have
in
frozen
that
now.
area of research or is
Great, we've just got you back. So yeah, so that point around research and knowing your audience, and then also thinking about how to present your findings to make it relevant, I think it's really important. Just going to move on to thinking then. We've talked a bit about the need to present information and very complex information. And Vanessa's just talked briefly then about the role of infographics, for example, as a way of bringing people into research findings. But I wonder if I could ask Andrew, your view really on whether you think the way in which research is presented has had to dramatically change post-COVID. And are there trends that you're seeing in terms of data visualization that you think are either really exciting or that you'd like to see more of?
Well, the way in which research has been translated, I think in the context of COVID, as I said earlier, it permeates and obsesses everyone, doesn't it? So I think lots of insights and research that, let's say, were bubbling along for a long period, and some of less, should we say, fundamental importance than others, are getting a degree of prominence that you would never expect, and including from non-science journalists, and clearly, as we were discussing earlier, I do think an important and concerning trend is the extent to which this whole situation is politicized. I think one of the really tragic things, we talked about face masks, for example. The reality is, let's say, when were we kind of a year ago, the WHO and its scientific advice was against face masks as a fundamental driver, was against border closures. There were many things where there were different perspectives on what the best approach was. And I think, for example, if we take topically for the UK in the last couple of days, school closures. I just see the sort of debate swinging in all directions around the latest political announcement. And unfortunately, like wearing a face mask, people, including scientists who engage on these topics, I think are increasingly afraid of being, exposed or labeled for a political agenda as opposed to the underlying science. As someone who writes about education a lot, yes, of course, we need to be concerned about the health risks, but, equally, we have to think about the wider trade-offs and the underlying mental health and learning loss issues for a much larger group of children. That's a really tangible and already demonstrated negative impact of wide-scale testing and isolation that we're seeing in the UK at the moment, when actually vaccination rates and severe hospitalization and so on has dramatically declined. And those are legitimate debates that need to be discussed, and discussed with scientists, not just holding the latest politician to account on whether they should pull their kids out of school or wear a face mask. I think that's the danger of drifting into the superficial and playing to the spin.
And it's just such a challenge, isn't it, when also the findings and interpretation of those findings is shifting at all times too, and that that uncertainty. I was just going to continue on one of the threads that sort of emerged in this conversation is about the idea that scientists are now in the spotlight, and we've had a question in about really about sort of online hate and some of almost the direct abuse that we've seen scientists, including Chris Whitty, but more I guess more sort of generic level, women scientists in general being sort of criticised quite heavily. And I wondered if I could sort of ask for Mark's view, almost at a more of a sector perspective, on what sort of female researchers, but researchers more generally, should do to manage some of the criticism and the overt abuse they may experience directly for the first time as they start to receive public profile.
Well, I think the role of women scientists appearing in the media is an important one, and you and I discussed this, Natalie, when I suggested that we have a woman scientist on the panel, but we couldn't find one. I think it's often the case, everyone listening knows this now, it's been well documented, that and there's been quite an interesting study looking at experts, gender. In most news programs, there are more male experts interviewed than female experts. Interview producers report that when they phone women up who may be more qualified or more senior, they're more reluctant to appear in the media. And the BBC has an interesting initiative to specifically target and train women, including scientists, so that they have the skills to appear in the media. So I think it's a particular challenge, and women, for various reasons, are more reluctant, and particularly for the women are more likely in all jobs to receive more abuse online than men. And we need to take that seriously and do much more about it. Just to change the subject slightly, there was a question which I think is quite interesting about audiences, because we're kind of assuming quite a high level discussion and a closer way of looking at the science. But I think we also need to think about how mainstream media reports scientists and the role that scientists play when they appear in mainstream media. Because again, someone in the comments section mentioned this, that scientists can appear in the media giving all the evidence they possibly can, for example, the vaccines work. And yet we still have people, I mean, I was talking to a friend yesterday, both his children are refusing to be vaccinated. Well, where does that come from? I mean, there is obviously a knowledge gap. And my worry is that we are super serving an audience that's interested in these issues. It can analyze and read data, can understand the complexities around the science and uncertainty. And yet we have a majority of the public that aren't on the same page at all and are not, the media isn't reaching them.
Yeah, I think, and I think again there was a question slightly earlier on from Terry at IDS around and what can we do, and there might be almost a desire for some more simplistic, even though there may to some people be forced interpretations of the science, and the challenge of that world of fake news and disinformation as being a sort of policy weapon as much as a media response. I just wanted to go back a step to the question that we had about challenging patriarchal structures, and actually Vanessa just asked again, because the question that's come in is for some practical guidance for the research community, but I think it's also one for those working in research communications about how do you address patriarchy when particularly that might be challenging, whether it's from a workplace perspective or in terms of even finding information to construct a story, and whether you have any sort of practical insights from your career that might be good to share.
Yes, but I've had my story shut down because it was going to rub on the wrong nerves. In Nigeria, we still are very much a hard copy reading community for newspapers, and we're going online. But what I was doing was, when I have those kinds of sensitive stories, I do my peer critique within my newsroom and outside that, and then I go to the online platform to have them. It's a bit of a challenge. Apart from two stories that were shut down, I would not really say that I experienced a lot of challenges with patriarchy, because my media organization gave me room to grow. I mean, I would say that. However, that's not the story of a lot of female journalists. It's important that when you have those kinds of situations, you should look beyond to collaborate. So if it's not working in your media house, or your newsroom, see if you can collaborate with another newsroom that will publish the story, or that will work with information is out there. Also, see if you could explore other avenues, like with what do you call it? Maybe influencers is not quite the word, but there are some influencers that have platforms that are reputable and trustworthy. Also, see if you could explore those kinds of avenues to publish, because it's important that we do not, as women, succumb to pressures of patriarchy. Otherwise, we'll be down. We'll never raise our heads. And it's also important that we know what we stand for as women, and you know, regardless how difficult the situations are. Because with me, my newsroom was very male heavy, and I made friends with the ones I could make friends with, who mattered. And that's how one way I was able to get some of my stories published. And over time, when they began to see the kinds of stories I was publishing, the impacts they're making, they relaxed. So I could be working on a story idea and not talk about it until it was almost done or near publishing, to avoid all the pressures of we want it now. But they knew that if I was presenting a story, the story they would not be able to say no to. So that's also something very, very important for us to do as women. Just be sure that you're not presenting mediocre stories. It's important that your story has quality and has good content in it as well.
And Vanessa, there's an interesting question that's just come up in the chat that follows on from what you said, because we talked about how maybe women scientists can be skilled up to be more confident to appear in the media. But the question is, what can media organizations do to be more receptive to women scientists? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would not say that media organizations really are antagonistic towards female scientists. I have had problems with reaching out to female architects and engineers for a story that we're trying to work on housing projects for internally displaced people. And they kept referring us to the president, who was male, or the secretary, who was male. But they were directly the ones who were working with these communities, because a lot of the victims were women. So when I keep meeting that kind of a brick wall for work that I'm doing, the tendency is to look elsewhere where my story will not be delayed or shut down because I didn't get a female voice to speak. Or we're then having to look at secondary sources for information rather than get primary interviews. So you're now looking on the internet for information that relates to what you're working on and would fit what you're working on. So my response is not that they're antagonistic towards them. I think that they need to be a lot more open to the media. And women, from what I have experienced, are a lot more skeptical and reserved about being spoken to, being interviewed by journalists. Even when they agree, they will ask you, oh, I want to see it first before you publish, or before you publish, send it to me, I want to check. Sometimes you do. By the time it comes back to you, you do not recognize the interview that they're sending back to you. So they need to reach out to the media as much as the media needs to welcome them. So if you have, and all these female scientists have their societies. So if you did courtesy call to media houses or made yourself known, introduce yourself. We want verifiable information. We want credible news sources. I don't think any media house would say no to you.
Vanessa, thank you. I was just actually, I think Daniel might have had a point in response. I don't know, Daniel, if you wanted to chip in.
Yeah, so I think in where I work now and where I've worked previously, we've occasionally tried to kind of audit the sources we use looking back at our stories. And that does obviously often throw up that we are biased towards men rather than women. So I think it's important for journalists to occasionally be kind of self-reflective in that way. But that there is a risk that then means that the women who are good at talking to the media get bombarded with more and more requests. So if you're thinking institutionally about how you can support your researchers to do this, to get their voices out there, I think it's important that you can't just say, well, the female scientists, the trans scientists who work for us, they should all go and speak to the media more. You have to make time for them. And as we've heard, like sadly, women do get more abuse from being online than men do. So we need to be careful that if you are pushing your voices out there, there are support structures in place for that, and there are policies for what you do if you have a researcher who starts getting abuse and threats online, and how you deal with that. So yeah, then journalists need to be more reflective, but institutions probably need to provide more support as well to make sure that they're not just piling more work on female scientists to try and even up the balance.
Daniel, thank you. I mean, actually, just on that point around journalists and potential bias, I was actually going to just turn to Andrew for a question that we've had in just around whether we've seen through COVID journalists actually displaying cognitive bias based on cultural and political norms. So, for example, thinking about the fact that in the early days of COVID, UK media really focused on the number of Brits stuck on cruise ships, maybe rather than the risk of the health crisis, or didn't really refer to the fact that many countries in the global south appear to be managing COVID far better than we did. So I guess I just wondered if you had some advice or thoughts on whether you do think journalism has a challenge around addressing bias and what newsrooms should be doing to counter it.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd say that, of course, journalists are human beings and they work in a social context. And of course, they will partly respond to the signals around them and the initiatives that are taken, and indeed what other media is reporting. I mean, I would say that, different organizations did take different perspectives, and for example, I wrote for many years about the coming pandemic threat and how it was more important and would be more lethal than terrorism, for example. So I think there are voices out there, but of course the mass of reporting is inevitably going to kind of follow the focus. How do you respond to it? I mean, I think there's partly a structural issue, and I'd go back on that question of diversity and perspective also to the previous question on gender. I mean, I know have much to do, but I'm very proud I work for a media organization where our editor is actually a Lebanese woman, where half of our most senior editors are female, where we've made very active efforts around recruitment of more junior staff from diverse backgrounds. And then beyond that, we are a global media organization like a number of the others here. We are not primarily read in the UK or staffed in the UK. And that also, I think, provides an important balance, because what one does think here, listening to certain and reading certain media outlets, that, the UK is, dare I say it, leading the world or at the front or exceptional in some way. But, we have colleagues in Brazil, in India, in Russia, in China, in South Africa, across Europe and beyond. And, the reality is we're, at different parts of the pandemic. So we were reporting, from Wuhan at the start of last year, for example. We were reporting firsthand on the spot in Italy. So, I think the more you can be held in check and balance and provide those global perspectives from your own networks, but also the feedback and the context of your readers, the easier it is to kind of pull out of a national or local bubble. And diversity, of course, is all part of that. I mean, going back to the gender question, I mean, structurally, for example, we're very active in trying to provide more voices, amongst others, to women in general, including in science. We actually have a bot that actually scans the photos that we use to actually look at the balance of images and try to ensure we have more women alongside men in suits illustrating our articles. We have a policy of no manels. So in conferences like this, we won't participate unless there's at least one woman who's present. Thank you, Vanessa, for saving us there. These are all structural things that one can do to try to provide wider context. And I think, gender is a very important part of it, international context, but, neurodiversity, sexual orientation, religious background, there are many different forms of diversity that we need to reflect. But going back to my point at the start, we must be very careful about tokenism. Underlying all of these voices, there has to be credible, rigorously backed insights and expert perspectives as well. And that benefits everybody.
Andrew, thank you. I was just going to pick up on that point around almost how do we address the twin challenges of more diverse, representative, inclusive, as well as needing specialists who can help us navigate the complexity of the research agendas and the policy discourses that we're within. And I just wondered if I could turn to Daniel for actually a question that was shared slightly earlier on around whether we need more specialists on topics who actually might help us give that deep research perspective, but actually be available to more journalists versus expecting a journalist to be able to get to grips with very complex policy agendas quickly.
I think there are obviously quite a lot of specialists most organizations will have specialist journalists on certain topics, and it just depends how granular they get. So my reporters might be specialists in particular disciplines or even particular types of research funding, whereas if you go to a national newspaper, they might have one correspondent who is doing all of science. And I think we kind of have to accept that there are fewer journalists doing more work now than there have been in the past, and that inevitably means that the ability to be hyper specialized is smaller. Like national newspapers maybe used to have 3 science correspondents, where some of them now have 1 or none. So while it would be nice if there were kind of hyper specialist journalists on tap for every publication, it doesn't really happen. Most people end up going freelance, and if they're good, being quite expensive to employ. So and being a good journalist inevitably involves having to get up to speed quickly in areas where you maybe don't have deep experience. If some new finding is made in a new area, you might get the call and be told to write it up. So I think we need to build skills into journalists about how they parse evidence and how they come to conclusions about things. But I'm not sure, sadly, that it's reasonable to expect everyone covering a story is totally knowledgeable in that particular area. And to go back to the point that was made earlier about like why was the British media focused on cruise ships, I think we may almost be the wrong journalists to talk about these questions, because we are in some ways, as Andrew said, lucky enough to have the time to be focused on particular areas and to find lots of sources. If you're working on the national news program and you get told in the morning, like, I need a 5-minute TV spot this afternoon, well, you maybe don't have the background all the time. So it's also important that researchers can explain their work in a way that can sell it to the public, if you like. So if you want to ask, well, why were we covering cruise ships? And I say we in the broadest sense there. It's like, well, the news is traditionally structured around people, and we call it stories because we are making stories about this stuff. It's a hard sell to an editor to say, well, I want to do 5 minutes or 10 minutes on your TV show about like why there's a shortage in this particular type of medical equipment, and it's all about supply chains and demand and manufacturing. And someone else is saying, well, give me 3 minutes and I'll have you loads of pictures of really angry people stuck on a cruise ship. That's about what the public has traditionally been thought to want to consume. And maybe that's shifting now. I hope it is, because as my people have been saying here, people now care about R numbers and viral spread and things like that. So maybe we've been underestimating the public, and again, the we in the broadest sense there, and maybe that will change. But yeah, I'm not sure we can all be specialists in everything.
Daniel, thank you. I'm just conscious Andrew Jack has just got to leave us in a few minutes, but before he goes, I just wanted him to answer one more question that's come in, and actually it's a question that once Andrew's answered and then left us, I'd like to just also pass it around to the rest of the panel. But the question really is a sort of combined one, and actually follows Daniel's point just now, but it's really about how do you enhance the skills of researchers to engage with the journalists, and also how do you, as a researcher, think about an effective communication strategy? What are the kind of tools that you should be considering? So maybe Andrew, if you could give us your perspective on that.
Sure, and I apologise, I missed responding to one of your previous points, but on visualization and data, I mean, I do think that's really fundamentally important and largely valuable and positive development. We have a huge commitment to graphics, to data, to interactive forms of insight. And one, of course, that's very powerful and is easily shared on social, but also it does provide, often, of course, you can be, there's the danger of false quantification, should I put it this way? But I think to have data, and there is a huge amount that's out there that really kind of goes beyond the anecdote, is a really valuable and useful service on the whole, and one we're certainly very committed to developing further. In terms of general advice on engagement and communication, as I say, I think, I'm a huge believer, particularly in an area like science, of course, there's a need for very theoretical and abstract and long-term work, but, the whole point to me of science, and indeed so many others of academia, should also be about relevance, about a commitment not just to research, but to disseminate and to influence practice. And I know there are structural barriers around the way in which academics often get incentivized and promoted. And I think there's a huge issue there that we need to hold university administrations to account around. But I do think, the importance of publishing in, as it were, practitioner outlets, and we've talked about the conversation. Another one I'm involved with is scidev.net. So to try and get in more accessible language the wider picture and the messages of the best science across the field out there are really important. As I said, being thick-skinned, accepting that 9 times out of 10, perhaps your messages won't get through, but really thinking about, if you had, sorry, cultural references here, but 3 minutes in a pub talking to a friend who knows nothing, from a school friend or something who knows nothing about your field, how do you just very quickly explain your point of view and the value of your research to them in a sentence or two? Journalists like others don't have the time to wade through a huge theoretical publication. They want to get to the point first to see whether it's worth reading further. And in the same way, when you're communicating orally or in writing or whatever with the wider world, you need to think about what's genuinely new, relevant, interesting, important. What are the practical implications and lessons, if any, out of that? That's the sort of thing that'll gain attention. And I'm a big fan as well, going back to the question of gender, of course, journalists, I hope, will increasingly reach out to that diverse and wider group. They need a reference point, which is a structural issue linked also to the culture of publications and scientific journals and other places where often one can identify credible new voices. But, I would also really encourage scientists to contact journalists directly by email, and of course different, sometimes it might be very intimidating, the thought you'd be sort of going live on television and attacked on Twitter or whatever. But, there are many other styles of journalism, including those reflected here, and many other kind of intermediate forms of engagement to build relationships and insights, which can share your views, even if not necessarily putting you directly on screen that you might feel embarrassed about. So those are some of the key things, but, thank you very much. And I think, very good to have this sort of seminar. I think, increasingly scientists are, wonderfully engaged in a very valuable and important sort of search for truth in a world of uncertainty. So I wish you all well. Unfortunately, I have to go back to writing a story on a deadline about infectious disease, but thank you very much for the chance.
Andrew, thank you very much. We'll let you go. Great, thank you. So, maybe actually if we can stay with that question and almost hand over to Mark, I wonder if you could give us your perspective on, so the question we have had from one of our attendees is about how do you develop an effective communication strategy? And I just wondered if you could give us your view on what you'd recommend, almost from the broadest aspects of what communications can involve.
Well, I think a lot of what Andrew said stands. First of all, it's about relationship building. As Vanessa said, she doesn't just want a press release to appear on her desk out of the blue. So you need to try and reach out to journalists who you think may be interested, or work for outlets that cover the issues that you're working on. So you need to develop an understanding of the media, and listen to it or watch it or consume it, so that the difference between, The Guardian and The Sun or BBC News, etc. And rather than firing off a press release to dozens of outlets that appears very generic, write 1 or 2 press releases to individual outlets where you think, from your understanding of how they've reported this or similar issues, they would be interested. Reach out to 1 or 2 and say, I read The Guardian and I think this would be a good story for you because. So develop an understanding of the media, build relationships, take up training opportunities. The BBC has this 50-50 project, which I mentioned earlier, where the goal is that in all discussion programs or current affairs or news on the Today program, etc., half the contributors are women, and there's a lot of resources from BBC Academy. If you're a woman scientist watching this, definitely sign up, get the training, and that will help you appear on the media. And think about all sorts of media. If it's slightly scary to appear on television or on the Today program, try your hand in a podcast. There are a lot of podcasts around, and they're much more conversational and they have more space. I think one of the challenges for scientists appearing in the news is you get very little space. You know, as Andrew said, like you're in the pub, you've got 2 minutes or 3 minutes to sum up your life's research. A podcast is much more discursive, and see if you can find opportunities to appear on podcasts. Maybe your own organization, IDS, has a very good podcast itself.
Right, thank you very much.
Can I quickly add to that? So in addition to trainings, I think scientists should also organize trainings for journalists. That way you also understand, you're also in the mind of journalists in the course of interaction. And then you also know how to push out what it is that you need to push out to them. And you're also equipping them to report accurately, you know, those science facts.
Yeah, good point.
I think that's a really good point, and actually it's nice. We've seen in the chat a few people sharing resources and also recommendations to courses they're also running. So again, that might be something for us to consider, whether one of the outputs from this is training for journalists. Daniel, I was just going to ask kind of one of that sort of that point around, you know, some of the skills. We've talked a lot about presentation of findings and relationships. I guess one of the other sort of key trends we've seen in the last few years has been about fake information, even thinking through to research that's been published in journals that was found not to be verified, and the whole concept of fact checking. It would just be really good to get your perspective on whether you think that's as prevalent as people almost are worried about, and also whether there's an element that you should be recommending to researchers on how they can make sure their work is verified and seen to be authentic.
Yeah, sure. Just to go back previously to the last one, I think yeah, Andrew said it. It stole the point I normally make to people about you have to be able to explain your findings to someone who doesn't have any kind of background in the area, and the anecdotes people use, or the way that people explain it, is often quite telling. But most journalists will say to a friend in the pub, or to your 7-year-old daughter, or to someone you see once a week from your church group. If you can't explain your research at that level and make it seem interesting, you are going to struggle to sell it to a journalist and to the public. So thinking about it in that way is quite useful. And I think also being honest about how interesting your research actually is. And one of the things that I love about writing about researchers and scientists is they are so enthusiastic about their work. It's brilliant. They will talk for hours about it. But sometimes that does cloud kind of judgment and taking a step back. If you have a very incremental finding in a field that doesn't particularly have wider relevance to the public, like, we understand that you're passionate about it and you have been working for 20 years on it, but you are still not going to get the front page of the New York Times. You need to think about which publications are particularly focused on maybe that area and pitch to them. On the disinformation side, it's obviously something that's discussed loads. And there are questions about how much the media should attempt to or can combat disinformation head on. I mean, years and years ago, when I worked in Nature and most other places in various times have experimented with doing kind of debunking stories and saying, oh, well, this alleged fact is circulating on social media and it's not true because, and those have slightly fallen out of fashion because there's now so much disinformation out there that it's almost questionable whether it's possible for journalism outlets to tackle it head on unless it reaches absolutely huge levels, like false claims from a president, for example, when they need to be addressed. So for how researchers can ensure that their work doesn't get twisted in that way, I think, again, it's this question of explaining it very simply and clearly, because if you can't do that, you leave a space for someone else to put their interpretation on your work. And if you're not willing to put yourself out there and talk about not just your work, but what's going on in your field, then you, again, are leaving space for other people to come in and maybe take your work and run with it, or just for a journalist to get something wrong. If I'm looking at a new research paper and I call up the researcher and say, can I talk to you about your work? And they say no, the problem is, well, maybe I don't understand it, and maybe I'll just think, oh, I don't understand it. I'll speak to someone else about it. But some people are going to be under such pressure to produce work that they'll write something on it anyway, because they'll have to appease an editor, not at my publication, but at other places. So being willing to talk to people and explain it is kind of key, I think.
Daniel, thank you. Vanessa, I don't know if you have a perspective on that, and actually sort of in response to Daniel's comments, we've had sort of further comments in the chat really about how even where we're presenting evidence and information and facts, rationalism just isn't acceptable to many people. And you know, I wonder, it's a huge question, one that's very challenging to address, but I wonder if there's a perspective from some of your reporting and whether you feel that's been a real challenge in how pieces may be received by some of your audiences. Vanessa, sorry, you don't know if, sorry, Vanessa, can you hear me?
Natalie, please, could you repeat your question?
Sorry, so my question is whether you've experienced the challenge of audiences maybe not responding or maybe being skeptical about a piece that you've written or produced, even though the facts you're presenting are right and it's a very rational thought. Is there a sense that actually people just want to believe something that's outlandish because maybe it's simpler or it just kind of captures the imagination?
I would say no. I'm thinking very hard if I've had any of those kinds of, I would say no. I don't remember that I've faced such, no.
And I wonder if, Mark, is there a sense from any of your climate change experience of whether that was something that you experienced?
I think this is a big issue in climate change reporting, and it's not enough for journalists to on their own decide what's important. They need to develop a better understanding of where the public is at. There's an organisation, Climate Outreach, that's done a lot of work on audience understanding and what are the messages that are counterproductive, or what are the ways in for skeptical audiences. And we can see that journalists have been on a journey. I mean, when I first started looking at climate change, it was reported as an environmental issue. Now it's reported in a much more 360 degrees way as an issue that affects all aspects of our life. But nevertheless, there are still gaps in the reporting. There's a sense, I think, in the way certainly UK media reports climate change, that you've either got the responsibility of the government to lead us and take the right kind of decisions, or you've got the responsibility of individuals. And I think people struggle with this idea of individual responsibility. The climate crisis is not the responsibility of individuals. We need to attack it from all sorts of different angles. Yes, what government does, what business does, what people do, and the reporting has to be quite sophisticated. And I think journalists now understand this. You know, there was a time when, I mean, there's been discussion, for example, about images that news outlets use to illustrate climate change. And the Guardian has done a project on this and has made a conscious decision to move away from those images of melting ice caps and polar bears to images that are more relevant, more directly relevant, so that audiences in the UK can see that climate change impacts on us. It's not a them problem that's happening far away. So journalists and editors need to think more carefully about where the audience is at, and the stories that they choose to cover, the angles and the images that they use, because all of these have major consequences on public understanding.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And actually the debate sort of continued alongside on the chat. And maybe, Daniel, I wonder if sort of a point really as much as a question, which is around how stories and images, to Mark's point, go viral, and actually what journalists almost can do to manage the pressure of wanting to link to a story that's going to get a huge amount of traffic, as much as help to explain and contextualize why it might give false information. And I wondered if you had any examples of where a story like that had come across your desk, and ways that you have now thought of how to that from happening again?
Sorry, do you mean to prevent overhyping something?
Yeah, so if you can imagine, I don't know, images, so like the melting of ice caps, for example, or images that seem to sort of get a life of their own, you know, whether you've seen that happen and how you'd stop that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, partly it's, again, it comes down to a resourcing issue. If you, somewhere which has good resources will have picture desk researchers whose whole job it is to find relevant images that are not overselling the story and not unrelated but visual. There are, I guess that there's always a tension in journalism between needing to sell the story and make it as impactful as possible. Like in decades ago, people talk about like sexing up a story, like give it a really hard-hitting headline, like give it a really strong picture, and keeping it true to what we know is happening or what we think is happening. And that's always a tension. And I think we have to acknowledge that. But I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with trying to sell a story and making it as strong as it can be. You want someone to see the headline and to click it, to see the picture, and to want to read the story. So I don't have any issue with going viral. Like, that's great. Loads of people will see our story, and if we've done our jobs properly, it will be balanced and fair and have a whole diversity of voices in, and that's good. The problem comes when they become either totally unrelated or almost cliche. So yeah, the polar bear standing on a melting ice cap. And in fact, there was one particular image, I don't know, I think it was in like the BBC Wildlife Photographer like 10 years ago or something, which was literally a polar bear on a melting ice cap in the middle of the ocean. And I think that was the point where people went, yeah, maybe we've seen a lot of this. But also, to circle back to something I was saying earlier, I think this is one of the things which is interesting with climate change reporting, is that people like to know, there need to be people in stories for them to be compelling for large numbers of the audience. So an abstract story about, well, the temperatures are going to rise 0.5 degree and the permafrost is going to melt, that is less compelling to some sections of the audience than you're not going to be able to get fresh fruit in your supermarket in the long term, or like this particular crop is gonna vanish and all these people who need it are gonna disappear. So I think that's one of the drivers behind that shift in climate change reporting, is it's having real impact on people now that we can demonstrate with research, and that drives it up the news agenda.
Daniel, thank you. Vanessa, I wonder if I could turn to you for the question around, you know, we've touched a bit there on how stories go viral, and we've talked a bit about how important it can be to have really strong imagery or even to have a politician endorse some findings. But as a journalist, do you feel under pressure to generate stories that get that, you know, get the internet traffic, support SEO? Is that something that sort of creeps into your mind when you're planning a story?
It's yes and no. You won't read does. You want the traffic, but you're reporting the truth and presenting it over sensationalizing it or exaggerating, you know, some the way you present it. So yes, while you want traffic, for my newsroom, like with us at CNN as equals, we're looking at more, what difference does it make to one person? You know, while there's traffic, it's important that it's the right traffic and it's the right audience, but we're not driven by traffic, we're driven by the quality of the story. So I would say not in that sense, no. Quality of the story, first of all, is what drives us to write the stories or to decide on which story we're pursuing and publishing. More impact than traffic.
Thank you. And maybe, Mark, do you think that it's had an impact in terms of global news agendas and how stories seem to get credence, and particularly in terms of the impact on a policy agenda? Do you think we're seeing journalists and politicians almost be more influenced by how much they'll be ranked on Google and the search profile of their editorial coverage? Well,
I think one of the interesting trends is that some media outlets have resisted this. We were talking earlier about what makes the news on television. it would have been very easy for television news to go down market and to do celebrity and consumer stuff. But we've been monitoring and analysing the content of the main TV news bulletins in the UK, ITV, BBC, Channel 4 and Sky. And they've stayed upmarket, if you want to use that word. They have a lot of international content. There's a lot of serious reporting. And they're not going down the clickbait route. So I think it's possible to resist. Generally, in my interactions with editors, the message I seem to be getting is that yes, they keep an eye on the public response, what people are clicking on, but they're not dictated by that. Journalists have their instincts, and they're very proud of their instincts of what constitutes a story, and they are still practicing their instincts. But I think what's interesting now is that journalists aren't just journalists anymore. They're curators of content. And for news websites to be successful, they are edited just like newspapers, and choices are made about what to give prominence to. And I think that curatorial role of journalists hasn't been as closely examined as it should.
Well, thank you. And that definitely seems to echo some of the points Vanessa was making. Daniel, I don't know if you had a perspective that you wanted to add.
Yeah, I think it's definitely true that journalists and especially editors have access to a lot more data now. The days of kind of sticking stuff on page and just going on your guts and your instincts are gone. And that's actually really helpful. Seeing the hit rates on stories, seeing what's doing well is really useful information to inform your decisions, but you can't just chase it. And it's really dangerous. I know some places have even considered paying their journalists based on how many hits they get. And that's just a terrible move. We need, and I've been involved in decisions where we've actually thought and openly discussed, I don't think this story is going to get many hits. I don't think it's going to get many readers, but we're going to do it. We're going to put the time into doing it because we want to put a marker down and say, this is important. We are covering this subject. But to not look at that information is equally foolish, because it can provide you insights. If I suddenly see, oh, well, this story that I thought was going to be an obscure story and not get many readers is getting loads and loads of hits, I want to know why, because I've probably missed something and not understood something about why that's interesting, and I should go and revisit that. It's not about chasing the hits. For me, it's about using the information that's out there to make the publication better and better serve its audience.
And I think another trend that's reassuring, I mentioned podcasts. Podcasts are very serious. You spend 20 or 30 minutes often listening to one person talk, and yet there's a huge public appetite for podcasts. The numbers listening are growing. People will listen to the whole podcast, 20 or 30 minutes. They'll then talk to it, talk about it to their friends, or even take action. So if we're hinting that journalism is going down market, there's a big public appetite for a kind of journalism that is more in depth and more analytical and more thoughtful, looking at just one story of the day. And I would encourage all the scientists listening, if they don't already consume podcasts, start consuming them and identify ones where you could take part.
Well, Mark, Daniel, Vanessa, thank you so very much. We're just a minute before we finish, but it just leaves me to say this has been a brilliant conversation. I feel like we could have probably gone on for another hour or so at least. We've also, thank you to my comms colleagues who are plugging our podcast as well, Between the Lines, which we obviously would really recommend listening to. There have been some really terrific resources shared in the chat through this conversation. So if you can, I would scroll back through. I think it's been terrific to hear firsthand your experiences and also the array of different perspectives on that core question that we asked ourselves today about the role of the media, and some really practical insights. So thank you so very much. We'll be sharing a recording of the seminar with everyone who's attended. A huge thanks from everyone at IDS to Vanessa, Daniel, Mark, and to Andrew. Thanks again to everyone who's joined us, and we look forward to being in touch in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.